Tax evasion by millionaires and billionaires tops $150 billion a year, says IRS chief. And I think most of us knew that tax evasion in the top 1% was wildly rampant, but honestly, $150 billion a year is way more than I would have guessed, but maybe I've just been naive. Now, the big things that millionaires, but usually and more specifically billionaires, do in order to write off taxes or evade $150 billion a year is they take personal trips or things or buy luxury items or goods, and they say that it is a business expense. So they'll take plane rides on company jets saying that it's a work trip. They will take trips on yachts and say that it's business, or the yacht will be owned by the company so nothing comes out of their personal bank account, and so on and so forth. Essentially, the business pays for whatever it is that they are doing, and they can claim it as a business expense, and as such, they do not personally have to spend the money. And that's because if they personally had to spend the money for a $500 million yacht, then they would have to take out salary or sell stocks to the tune of that $500 million, and that would require them to pay capital gains tax and also income tax, which obviously they're not interested in doing, as you can see from the headline. So that means they need to run it through the business so that they personally don't have to pay for anything. However, thanks to Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS now has some $700 million that it can use in order to audit millionaires and billionaires and make sure they are actually, one, paying the amounts that they owe, two, paying any back taxes or tax debts they might have, and three, make sure that the business expenses they have are actually business expenses. And as you can see, the IRS has released this update on their website talking about it. The IRS begins audits of corporate jet usage, which is one of the luxury ways that millionaires and billionaires get around taxes, part of larger effort to ensure high-income groups don't fly under the radar on tax responsibilities. Using Inflation Reduction Act funding and as part of ongoing efforts to improve compliance with high-income categories, the Internal Revenue Service announced today plans to begin dozens of audits on businesses, aircraft involving personal use. The audits will be focused on aircraft usage by large corporations, large partnerships, and high-income taxpayers, and whether, for tax purposes, the use of the jets is being properly allocated between business and personal reasons. The IRS will be using advanced analytics and resources from the Inflation Reduction Act to more closely examine this area, which has not been closely scrutinized during the past decade as agency resources fell sharply. The number of audits related to aircraft usage could increase in the future following initial results and as the IRS continues hiring additional examiners. And this is big. Basically, they didn't have the money or the manpower before to audit the ultra-rich's use of luxury vehicles and goods, even though they probably had a good idea that these billionaires were taking advantage of the system. I think it's kind of an open secret that billionaires use personal stuff all the time, but up until very recently, the IRS couldn't do anything about it because they just simply did not have the money. And I get it, the IRS is not always good at or not always particularly efficient with their jobs and the money that's allocated to them. But in this specific instance, it seems to be doing pretty well. As you can see here, IRS ramps up new initiatives using Inflation Reduction Act funding to ensure complex partnerships, large corporations pay taxes owed, continues to close millionaire tax debt cases. The IRS shared today's progress in its focus on people using partnerships to avoid paying self-employment taxes, as well as new details on current enforcement priorities. The IRS is continuing to pursue millionaires that have not paid hundreds of millions of dollars of debt in tax debt, with an additional $360 million collected on top of the $122 million reported in late October. The IRS has now collected $482 million in an ongoing effort to recoup taxes owed by 1,600 millionaires, with work continuing in this area. That is a huge amount of money, $482 million collected in what is a relatively short amount of time, basically since late October. That is so much money that's been collected, and it goes to show how much more is probably out there yet to be collected by people who are exploiting and avoiding the system. Now, whether or not the IRS will actually break even on the billions of dollars given to them to carry this out, probably they won't. But the idea is they don't necessarily need to, because if other millionaires and billionaires see people are being cracked down on and audited, they may start owning up or fessing up and paying their taxes properly, and as such, you wouldn't even need to audit them in in the first place. So the ultra rich have been avoiding taxes for a while and are now being caught and being forced to pay up what they owe to the people that they owe. And that is all well and good, but I do also want to be critical of this article as well, because really it does not get everything right. And there are two main things that it gets wrong. The first is that it calls it tax evasion. Here it says tax evasion by millionaires and billionaires tops $150 billion a year, says IRS chief, but that's not exactly what was said by the IRS chief. The full quote is here on this nysscpa.org website. This is what he actually said. When I look at what we call our tax gap, which is the amount of money owed versus what is paid for, millionaires and billionaires that either don't file or are underreporting their income, that's $150 billion of our tax gap. For complex filings, it became increasingly difficult for us to determine what the balance due was. So to ensure fairness, we have to make investments to make sure that whether you're a complicated filer who can afford to hire an army of lawyers and accountants, or a more simple filer who has one income and takes a standard deduction, the IRS is equally able to determine what is owed. And to us, that is a fair system, which is great to see. But what actually he's talking about here is what's called the tax gap, not tax evasion. A tax gap covers people that either forget to file or accidentally mess up something in their filing or claim deductions maybe they weren't eligible for. And this covers both people that are dishonest, as many millionaires and billionaires are, but also people that just make an honest mistake because the tax system is so complicated and it's not always clear what can be used for any given deduction. So yes, there is tax evasion, but not all of the tax gap is explained by evasion. It can also be explained by people just messing up because the tax code is overly complicated and business in America is also overly complicated. The second issue I take with this article is what's here in the first paragraph. It says the nation's millionaires and billionaires are evading more than $150 billion a year in taxes, adding to growing government deficits and creating, quote, a lack of fairness in the tax system, according to the head of the Internal Revenue Service. And specifically, the thing I take issue with here is it says that it's adding to the growing government deficit, which it's kind of really not. If you look at the annual budget for the United States of America, they only brought in something like $4.9 trillion, but essentially in fiscal year of 2023, it was $6.2 trillion. Take that out of the $150 billion that's reported in this article, and $150 billion divided by $6.2 trillion is about 2.5%. This only impacts the federal budget or federal deficit to the tune of not even 2.5%. It's basically inconsequential when it comes to matters of the government deficit and spending. It contributes to the government deficit kind of in the same way that using a hairdryer contributes to global warming. Like, yeah, maybe technically it does, but realistically, even if every one of these ultra rich paid every penny they owed, it would not even begin to make a dent in the government deficit. So saying that it does is kind of ingenuous. That being said, however, I personally am overjoyed that these people are finally being forced to pay what they owe. Thanks for watching.